Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
This was what was behind Brexit. People want control and agency and belonging and a sense of connection to the place they live in. And the rejection of the EU was a sort of emanation of this distrust of remote power.
I'm Christopher Hope, also known as Chopper, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Chopper's Politics. Internal warfare in the walls of Downing Street, an isolating Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn readmitted to the Labour Party, but not to the Labour Parliamentary Party, and fresh hope for a coronavirus vaccine. It's certainly not been the quietest of weeks in politics, but then, it never is nowadays, is it? So as many of us are finding lockdown 2 rather monotonous, Boris Johnson has had a week he'd probably rather forget, with two of his closest aides leaving Downing Street after accusations of leaks and briefings. We'll be discussing Lee Kane and Dominic Cummings' departure with two people who know a thing or two about whether number 10 is more like the thick of it than the West Wing, Polly Mackenzie and James Starkie. And in case the monotony is getting you down or feeling a bit empty, we're joined by writer Rhidian Brook with some words of wisdom that will leave you thinking, well, perhaps more optimistically about the future. But first, coronavirus has turned community spirit from a hum into a roar. Hundreds of thousands of people signed up to be NHS volunteers in the summer, and it wasn't just on Thursday evenings that left us feeling, well, a bit more connected to our neighbours. It's one part of the pandemic that the PM doesn't want to see the back of. He commissioned a report in the summer about how the government can build on this momentum, and the man behind that report, Danny Kruger, the MP for Devizes, is with me now. Danny Kruger, welcome to Chopper's Politics. Great to have you on. You wrote a report in the summer called Levelling Up Our Communities, Proposals for a New Social Covenant. That sounds very important and complicated. What's it about?
Well, it was inspired by the extraordinary upsurge in neighbourliness and community spirit that we saw in the spring and summer when suddenly, out of nowhere, huge numbers of people mobilised themselves. They weren't asked to do it before local councils or national government could move when the lockdown was announced. Suddenly, people were organising themselves into mutual aid groups, as they became known, and setting up, whether through WhatsApp or just word of mouth and door to door, this support network for people who are self-isolating. And so what the government asked me to do is to think about, how can we support that through any further lockdowns and COVID response into the recovery phase, help get our country back on its feet, but also, and I think most excitingly, what's the future for social policy and for the way communities work beyond COVID, and can we build on what we've seen this year to create a better system for the future?
We have a WhatsApp group working in our road, and we look out for each other, and if someone's isolating, they ask for some shopping to be done, that happens. Why should the government get involved in this? Won't they just wreck it?
Very good question, and that is the challenge. And a lot of people I've spoken to, it's rather like when the big society came along 10 years ago. People said,
here we go.
Why does David Cameron need to start, telling us about being good neighbours and looking out for each other? We're doing that anyway.
Yes.
I think there is a role for government. And if we think about where we're at now, the immediate need back in the spring and summer was literally to get shopping and prescriptions and so on collected for people who are self-isolating. As we look forward, we have entrenched social challenges in this country. We had them anyway, and the economic downturn that we're entering is going to make them more entrenched. We need better systems for supporting each other. And, yes, spontaneous neighbour-to-neighbour social action is absolutely vital and wonderful. But we also need systems to support that. We need infrastructure for our communities as well as just people doing the right thing for each other. So I think there is a role for government, not necessarily just through funding, although I would like to see some of that.
Yeah.
But in helping to coordinate the work of volunteers and charities. And in Wiltshire, where I'm the MP, the council has been really good because they've basically set up a system that if you have any kind of needs, you ring the council. They won't fix it for you themselves. They will send you to the local group that can meet the needs that you have. So I think there is a role for government in helping to coordinate and signpost and resource this work.
Yeah, I was struck by a couple of eye-catching ideas. The idea of pop-up parishes to create a local structure for helping communities, and an annual Neighbours Bank Holiday, which sounds fantastic. This report came out in September, and it came out, I think that the timing was just a bit late for the easing of restrictions. It came out just as we were going back into the tiers, I think, at that point. So it maybe didn't get the coverage it was meant to get, but Boris Johnson did ask for you to do the report. What's happened since September?
Well, I was pleased with the reaction. Government was very positive about what I said, but I explicitly said in the report, I don't suggest that government just takes this set of suggestions from me and tries to implement them. What I have written is that, we've seen this amazing upsurge in neighbourliness, and we've discovered the latent power in communities and the spirit of innovation in frontline services. And what we now need to do is to have a very open policy-making process by which local people who've got involved in these mutual aid groups and local councils and businesses and civil society organisations, charities and so on, should be invited to contribute their insights into their experience over this year and what they think they need for the future. And that's what is happening. The Minister for Civil Society in the Culture Department, Diana Barron, is leading an engagement process. Different parts of my report apply to different parts of government. So there's ideas around, social care and how to look after older people. There's youth policy. Those bits of those policy suggestions are being considered by particular ministers, and I'm in contact with them. So there's not some big switch that needs to be switched now. There's a whole range of suggestions that government is dealing with, which I'm pleased about.
Yeah. Do you think this lockdown 2 is the same as lockdown 1 in the sense that we're not really applauding on the steps, are we? You're not applauding at the NHS each Thursday night. Are people getting weary of being good neighbours, or is it still out there?
No, it's very much still out there. And I mean, it's now just become business as usual. There are systems set up, quite informal ones, that are by which people who are self-isolating or shielding are being looked out for. And, in Wiltshire, they've stepped up again the support system that came into being in the spring. That's now being put on a permanent footing, in fact. Very impressed by what's being done there. So, I mean, yes, we're not so sort of perhaps ostentatious in our neighbourliness, but it's now become more business as usual and just part of what happened.
How are you helping your neighbours, Danny Kruger?
Well, I'm part of the Devises COVID support group. So I volunteer with this group that I mentioned, and it's a great pleasure, actually. I was about to say privilege, which is sort of a bit phony. Although it is a bit of a privilege. People bring up the phone number because they need help with their shopping, and they run you through their shopping list, and you get insight into what everyone's getting. And then you write all that down, and then some other brilliant volunteer goes and gets it for them. It's just a very interesting way of connecting with people. I just think volunteering is more for the benefit of the volunteer than the people who are being helped. We
have people in my family volunteer at a local food bank, and they just love it. Yeah. You do feel part of it, and it connects you. I always thought back in the day in 2010, 2015, the idea of the big society was a good idea. I thought it was a bit wrongly pitched. The word society is not one which normal people use. They use the word community, and I think if you called it a big community, that would have had a better selling point. I think.
Well, they should have asked you, Chris. I don't know. I mean, community becomes a bit of a bogus word as well sometimes. I mean, there's no language that is perfect for this, and that's because it's so particular and personal and local. Government struggles to frame policy around this. It also struggles to get the comms right. But yes, I think there was a problem with the way we pitched the agenda back then. And I don't really blame Steve Hilton, the genius, who was the brains behind it all. I don't blame him and David Cameron or any of that. I don't think the timing was terrible because it coincided with really difficult budget cuts and austerity. And it didn't get the support of the whole of government, of course.
No.
And it didn't last as a theme. But I still think it was the right idea at any time, but it's particularly right now. And we need to repackage it, perhaps, and find some different language. But the idea of trusting society, or whatever we call it, communities, real human beings, not bureaucrats in Whitehall, is the right one. I mean, my perhaps perverse view is that this was what was behind Brexit. People want control and agency and belonging and a sense of connection to the place they live in. And the rejection of the EU was a sort of emanation of this distrust of remote power. And my political hope is that the government goes beyond taking back control from Brussels to London or to Westminster and goes the whole hog and enables local communities to take back control. And we can see real empowerment that way.
We've been following the row about the Free School Meals Initiative and Marcus Rashford driving the Tories into a corner, making them apparently have to fund more support over the holidays, although arguably that was already planned by the government, but it was reported as such as being a U-turn by the government. Do you think there's a more of a feeling in winter that the government should do more, not communities? Has there been a change in view of the way we handle this pandemic, the lockdown part of it?
No, I don't. But I mean, I recognise the critique. I think we are on a fighting to nothing if we set up some alternative, some conflict between what government should do and what society should do. They both need to play their part. And yes, you could say in winter with more entrenched economic difficulties that we've got, government needs to step up further. But equally, we need to liberate enterprise and to trust people and to get the economy open and working again. So I don't think it's an either or. I mean, I deeply regret that we managed to, look so flat-footed on the holiday meals issue, because actually we had and have a better idea than supermarket vouchers for all preschool meal families. And what was announced the other day was not a U-turn; it was the fulfilment of the narrative that we'd been articulating all along, which is that families need more than just vouchers. Many of them just need cash, which is why we increase universal credit, but mostly they need social support. They need a community to come around them and help them over the long term. And that's what is being introduced through the holiday food and activities program. I mean, I credit to Marcus Rashford for, making it so salient. He also stimulated an amazing, more of what I've been describing, which is communities stepping up. And I don't regret that they did that. And I don't think it was government's job to do everything.
Did you think we might emerge as a less materially focused society after this? Do you think that people matter more, our neighbours matter more?
Yeah.
Is that the future out of lockdown too? I mean, I might not feel it in the darkest days of November, but I wonder if that's where we're going.
I think it's interesting what the world has done in this year. It has basically decided to put people ahead of profit and the economy, and that might have been a terrible thing to do, because people might suffer more long term because of the economic downturn. So I'm not saying that everything that's been done is right, and that the economy is, secondary and irrelevant. On the contrary, we absolutely need prosperity. But it's interesting that a sort of moral choice was made this year, and I think that reflects a change that's happening in our culture, which is that we are turning back to a deeper set of values and considerations, and we're turning away from the idea that human fulfillment is found purely through material prosperity, and that the only consideration of public policy is how to drive the engine of growth. We thought about how it's distributed more, and we're thinking about people and places that have been left behind by globalization and economic growth. And I think in our culture we see all sorts of interesting ways in which people are turning towards less material considerations, including thoughts about the environment and about society. So I think something positive is happening in our culture, as long as we don't think that means trashing the economy too, because that would be disastrous.
Now, Danny Kruger, while you're on, I've got to ask you about the Prime Minister. You were his political secretary in number 10 from August last year until the election, when you became the MP to Devises. How do you work out what's going on with the PM at the moment? Do you think we might be seeing the old Boris coming back now that these advisors have left, or has that been overwritten? Well,
as you'll understand if I don't get too stuck into the intricacies of personnel in Downing Street, it's really important that the public holds politicians to account and advisors work for politicians. And it's, in a sense, not really our business who the Prime Minister relies on for advice. But what I'd say is that Boris Johnson is a marvellously mercurial character, and he is capable of, he comprehends, accommodates the whole Tory tradition. And that includes what I'm inspired by this more romantic focus on place and community, but also he's a modernizer and believes in growth and prosperity. And I think that the old Boris, as you saw, we were used to the entertainer, we were used to the sort of bulldog character battling Brussels during the Brexit crisis this time last year. And then this year has all been about head down, battling with this incredibly difficult pandemic. And of course, his sort of presentation is going to be different. So I don't think there's been any loss of his character or drive. And let's hope, for all of us, what we all want to do is, in a sense, get back to our more confident, optimistic selves. And as the end of the tunnel approaches with what we hope will be a successful vaccination program and a recovery in the first half of next year, then I'm sure we will see the more upbeat Prime Minister return. What's going on in terms of number 10? I mean, let's see. I have a great confidence in the ability of the team there to navigate a very successful path out of this. And, we've all got to play our role in that in Parliament in helping to support him.
Danny Kruger, the MP for Devizes, thank you so much for joining us this week on the podcast, and we will put a link to your report into the show notes for any listeners keen to read more about your report. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And if you've been involved more with your community during lockdown and have some thoughts on what Danny's been talking about there, do get in touch. Please email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or follow us on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast. Right, stay with us. Next up, we'll be talking about what's next for number 10 Downing Street. Now, Dom has gone with two former special advisors. Right after news of another podcast you might enjoy.
It begins as a love story. Couples who meet as young activists, bonded in a fight against injustice.
We seem to have similar outlooks in life. He often made me feel very special.
It felt like we were in love. I remember it being quite magical.
As far as I was concerned, we had a future together.
I fully did envisage my future with him.
But then, he starts acting strangely.
Suddenly there were secrets and there were inconsistencies and there were things that didn't make sense.
Then one day, he leaves.
I came home from work and I realised immediately that he'd gone.
Vanishes without a trace. And the reason why these men disappear is so disturbing, it's led to a formal apology from the state.
I never for a moment thought that it would be what it actually turned out to be.
This is Bed of Lies, the true story of one of the biggest scandals in recent British history, and the latest podcast from the Telegraph.
Talk about the Stasi in East Germany. That's not how we understand our society.
A tale that travels from the safety of a loving bedroom to the very heart of the law. Search for Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
And we're back. Now, for a week, Westminster has been buzzing with news of the three Cs: Kane, Cummings and Carey. First, Lee Kane, the PM's Director of Communications and a key player in the Vote Leave campaign, resigned. He'd been offered a promotion to become the PM's new Chief of Staff. But when that news leaked last week, there was a backlash from Tory ranks, reportedly including Mr Johnson's fiancée, Carrie Simons, effectively forcing out Mr Kane. And before long, Boris Johnson's chief advisor Dominic Cummings had also quit, this time leaving through the famous black door in number 10 Downing Street, carrying a box of his pencil sharpener, his stapler and his sellotape for the cameras to see. So what's all this party infighting in 10 Downing Street mean for us out here? Don't forget, there's a bloody war on against coronavirus. Two people who can try and tell us are Polly Mackenzie, a former advisor to Nick Clegg when he was Deputy Prime Minister, and James Starkie, who advised both Michael Gove and Priti Patel in the recent government. To you first, James Starkie, do you think the SpAds matter too much at the moment?
I definitely think that probably SpAds, it's not ideal when they're in the papers. I mean, you know, special advisors are at the end of the day advisors. Advisors advise and ministers decide. And for that reason, it should, in my view, it should be the elected officials that are appearing in the paper rather than the advisors.
Polly Mackenzie, do you agree with that? Do you think we're seeing too much of people who really shouldn't be in the news at all, like James says?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, advisors are important. They help ministers to deliver the agenda for which they're democratically accountable. But essentially, they are still servants. You know, they are there to implement the agenda of the minister, not their own agenda. You know, you get the extraordinary privilege to be in the room, to put the case for what you believe should happen. And then the minister decides and you suck it up, whether you like it or not. And it does seem to me that far too many advisors have been neglecting that basic point and just kind of using tactics, whether it's briefings or manipulation, to try and get their way anyway. That's why they attract the attention. It's because they're contradicting their minister. And if they didn't do that, they wouldn't attract attention.
I agree with Polly. I think what you do always need to be cautious of is it's not your agenda. You weren't elected. And you are ultimately working to your boss's agenda and ultimately the Prime Minister's agenda.
Polly Mackenzie, did you ever see any similar examples when you were in government of overweening advisors being dumped out the back door by a government?
Well, I mean, certainly relationships break down. I think a self-respecting advisor leaves once they no longer have the ear of the minister. I mean, you kind of can cling on if your minister feels so inclined to let you whilst not really doing anything, just sort of sit in a room and like twiddle your thumbs and collect your salary. But I think there are others who felt that they were no longer being listened to. They were no longer of use, really, who then left. So Steve Hilton, for example, some people consider that he flounced off, but others would just say his time had come and he moved off to do something else. James O'Shaughnessy, who served in Number 10 as policy director for the first couple of years under Cameron, who then just decided that the way he could make change in the world was to do something different, partly because he was no longer one of Cameron's closest advisors. And so other alternatives presented themselves. I think the flouncing requires a certain personality type, which is probably best left out of Downing Street altogether. But leaving, moving on to bigger and better things, or choosing to go and be an MP, those are all perfectly reasonable things that will inevitably happen, even among a really good team.
James Starkie, does it matter to you, do you think, or to the government, that Lee Kane and Dominic Cummings have left now? Do you think it will see a change, a refocusing on parliamentary democracy? Because it is not the case that the relying on advisors will attempt at making the UK more like the US, where advisors matter more than the legislature.
Well, look, I worked with both of them. I think Lee's very talented, and I'm sure any government or department would miss having him around because I think he has a lot to offer. But more broadly, look, the world always continues. Things always carry on. In these situations, you get people who kind of do like someone or don't like someone. It's never as bad as anyone claims. It's never as good as anyone claims. There's still a lot of talented people, in my view, in Downing Street and in the government more generally. And I think the idea that the agenda will totally flip, I don't personally agree with that. I think it's, we campaigned in a manifesto, and everything that I've seen coming from government is that, we'll continue to do that. So I think these things can be overdone, if I can say that.
Polly, do you agree? Do you think the government can survive this?
No question. I think it'd be really great if they were to set up a Downing Street that could really work. And they haven't had that for the last 18 months. So, it would be churlish to ignore some of their achievements, including, pretty historic election victory. Nevertheless, what have they accomplished in terms of really getting the machinery of government working? For me, the metaphor that works is that Prime Minister's the driver, Downing Street is the gear stick and the gearbox, but it's not the engine and it's not the car. The key thing is making it so that it can translate what the Prime Minister wants into leadership, values and ideas that keep the engine going and make sure that you can travel in that direction. Dominic Cummings, when he wrote his blogs about needing mavericks and data scientists, in government, he's completely right. In Downing Street, no, you've misunderstood what the function of Downing Street. It's about connecting the Prime Minister to the machine of government. And once it grows beyond that connecting function, once you try and pull every single decision into Downing Street, literally man-mark every decision, every person, it falls to pieces because you can't possibly do that. Dominic's been very successful running small organisations like a campaign, right, where you can control every individual. You don't need to read many management textbooks to understand that running really large organisations, and hundreds of thousands of people work for the government one way or another, to run large organisations requires an entirely different style of leadership. You need somebody who's more like an Ed Llewellyn, more like a Jonathan Powell, somebody who's really about the service of the Prime Minister and understands how those really large, complicated organisations work and can connect them to the agenda.
James Starkie, Polly's there talking about new chief of staff type person. Who would you hire if you were the Prime Minister?
I wouldn't say names, and I'm sure the Prime Minister will have clear ideas himself. I mean, I think from a kind of media perspective and a narrative about any given government, they always want, let's call it a Svengali figure. There's always someone who's kind of identified as that. What Polly mentioned, which is kind of about the specific roles you're going to do. I mean, that's one thing you always do need to be clear on. If if we're talking about advisors in general, they can fulfill a variety of functions. They can act in a kind of more project management role, what you might think of as a management consultant, where they're essentially taking a task and driving it through. They can act as policy advice, and they can act in the media forum as well, providing media advice. And I'm sure there's more. I think the thing you need to be doing when you look at any individual is, what do I want that person to do? And therefore, what's the skill set to do it? So I think the first thing, which I'm sure the Prime Minister will do, is to think, what roles do I want to fill and exactly what function do I want that to fulfill?
James Starkie, you're an old friend of Dominic Cummings. What's next? Are we expecting some 10,000-word blog this weekend?
I don't know. I haven't spoken to Dom for a while. He does like a good blog. We all know that. But maybe he's off to his bunker to read some more books. Who knows?
While you're both on, my phone's been buzzing away in my hand here. Keir Starmer has decided not to give the whip back to Jeremy Corbyn, even though he's been allowed back into the party by the party's national executive. You won't know this unless you're following Twitter at the same time as talking to me, but Polly Mackenzie, is that the right decision to make by Keir Starmer?
Sounds like a bit of a fudge, to be honest. I thought it was odd to let him back into the party when he didn't really apologise for what he'd said. But it sounds like there might have been, honestly, understanding the internal machinations of the Labour Party is profoundly beyond me, because it has more committees than even the Liberal Democrats. So I don't quite understand how that happened, how Keir Starmer made a mess of it, because I think it looked strong for him to have kind of cancelled Corbynism so decisively, and it played on his strong message of, under new management.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it was the party which removed the membership from Jeremy Corbyn, but it's the issue of the whip is Keir Starmer, and suddenly it's now Keir Starmer taking on Corbyn, isn't it, James Starkie? He's saying to Corbyn, I will not give you the right to vote as Labour MP, which is quite a moment.
It is, and politically it's perhaps a shoot of him, but what I think it does highlight is that for all of the talk over the past year, and I think Keir's done a fairly steady job, there is still a long way to go in the Labour Party to kind of go over and deal with some of the things that came up from the Corbyn years. This is just one of the biggest perhaps issues, but one of the many issues that I think they'll be dealing with for quite some time. And it's been the case that because of various other goings on, the press attention hasn't quite been on them. But personally, I think it shows just how much the Labour Party still have to deal with if they are going to be to go back to the country in 4 years and say, we are a potential party of government. I think they've got a long way to go.
James Starkie, Polly Mackenzie, thank you so much for joining me this week on Choppers Politics. Now, many of you, dear listeners, might have been scrabbling for words of comfort during this tumultuous 2020. And one place offering us a few minutes of quiet reflection, well, in fact, 2 minutes, 45 seconds to be precise, is Thought for the Day at 10 to 8 on Radio 4's Today programme. Now, if you don't know what Thought for the Day is, it's a slot where religious leaders and thinkers reflect on the news of the day. Rhidian Brook is an award-winning novelist, screenwriter, and one of those commentators. In his latest book, God Bothering, Rhidian's compiled 100 of those thoughts from the past 2 decades into one volume. I started by asking him on the podcast where he found inspiration.
I think I just try to put myself in the shoes of the listener. You're going out at 10 to 8 and people are half listening, not listening, switching you off. So you've got to be aware of that, I think. And you're just trying to plant one thought in people's minds. So, your opening has to be fairly arresting if it can be. And I guess over the years, I've come slightly more pastoral in my approach with the thoughts. You don't want to harangue people. At the same time, you don't just want to dish up what people want to hear. You have to be a challenge to the status quo. So you're looking to be both pastoral and prophetic, to use kind of two religious words. I mean, a prophet, there was a thought for the day by James Jones, which was talking about this very thing, which is, a prophet always has to say the difficult thing. So I'm not claiming that I'm a prophet, but I'm just saying you've got to speak truth to power. You've got to say the uncomfortable thing sometimes at the risk of seeming unpopular. So there's no one truth that you're looking to communicate. I mean, obviously, I'm a Christian, so I'm coming from a particular faith perspective. But you can't come at it straight. You have to come at it slant, if you like. There's a phrase, you can't serve what you ain't cooking. And I always sort of slightly feel, rather than sort of spout a political opinion on something, or even a theological one, it's easier to come from a personal place, an incident or something that's happened or an encounter that you've had. I try and give them a sense of being a story if I can.
Do you get any feedback from listeners?
Well, back in the day, you used to get letters, the green ink letters. And actually, to be honest, a lot of them were very kind, or quite a lot of them were from Christians correcting me on my misuse of scripture. There were a few unpleasant ones, but in the age of Twitter and social media, it's a much more instant response, and it's usually a decent one. Sometimes it might trigger a debate or an argument, but yeah, you do get feedback, and it's much more instant than it used to be.
Has it had its time, do you think? Is it still a robust, protected 2-minute slot on the Today programme?
Well, it's always, I've been doing it 20 years. It's always been under attack, if that's the right word, from various quarters. I think it's got more difficult to do thought in recent years because there's so many different restrictions being imposed upon it, not just from the BBC, but from just the wider public, so it's become tougher to do. It was championed greatly by Christine Morgan, who's head of religion until this year. And she made it a broader church, literally, taking it out to a wider kind of set of faith voices. I think it's a sort of Marmite thing. If it wasn't there, people would notice it. A lot of people love it. Some people don't. Some people just switch it off. But I once missed Thought for the Day, the slot at 10:02, because my car didn't pick me up. And the next morning in The Guardian, the leader said, "Where's Thought for the Day when you need it?" So I thought, well, people still measure their day by Thought for the Day, whether they listen to it or not. So it's it's part of the culture. It's part of the national body clock, if you like. So you have to remember that. I just think it's a huge privilege to be able to do it. And every word counts. So I sort of take it very seriously. I'm still kind of nervous when I do it, even though I've been doing it for 20 years.
Yeah.
I really work it. I'm thinking it's 6 million people listening to it as well. If only I had that many readers of my novel. So it's a huge audience. So you have to take that responsibly and seriously when you're doing it.
You mentioned there that the BBC's restrictions of what you can say. What are those rules? I mean, surely you can mention God if you want.
I think actually it's not coming from the BBC. I think it's coming from the wider culture and the sort of risk of offence, I guess. That's something that, it's got harder to negotiate that. So obviously there are other people who are coming at Thought for the Day, the Humanist Society. They want, why can't we have a humanist or even an atheist voice on the slot? My personal belief on that is it would be interesting to hear that. I'd quite like to hear an atheist Thought for the Day. I'd like to know who they quote. And I think they get to see how difficult it was to do, actually, as well. But the remit is a spiritual take on something in the news, and that's always been the case. And it's a tiny slot. It's 3 minutes in the middle of a 3-hour radio program. And it's an anomaly. It's sort of, and I think I like the fact that it is an anomaly. It's sort of, what's it doing there? And I find I like that. It's sort of how strange, but how wonderful that this thing is there. This sort of oasis in the middle of a very sort of full-on interrogative political program.
And also a full-on time for millions who are in the middle of second lockdown, of course. Do you think people are more open to the messages of Thought for the Day? Are we getting more spiritual, more in need for less material things in the lockdown?
I think what lockdown's done, we've heard the word existential threat a lot. And I think that's both a personal and a general thing. I think people have really had to face death, and people have lost people, and they've had to think about their own mortality. So the big questions that Thought should engage with and does engage with have suddenly become slightly more relevant. The day-to-day, a lot of people haven't really been thinking about these things, and I think this has really forced that. And I think people's essential weakness and vulnerability is more apparent, and I think people want to know, well, what speaks to that? Is there anything that speaks to that? So it's trying to kind of get that into your thoughts. And I think over the course of lockdown, I've noticed Thought has really stepped up. It's been very pastoral again, I think. It's spoken into the crisis. It's tried to encourage, you've got to avoid peddling a sort of trite consolation or a sort of convenient illusion. But at the same time, you're trying to speak hope. You're trying to speak of something perhaps bigger than what is even going on, if that's possible.
Well, Rhidian Brook, I think we should end on one of your favourite thoughts of the day. What do you think of that? We can look back over 20 years. You can pick out the one that most suits the now. What do you think of that?
Yes, that'll be lovely.
Great. Well, I'll take this moment to quickly say thank you to my guests this week, Danny Kruger MP, Polly Mackenzie, James Starkie, and of course, Rhidian Brook. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Theo Ludis, and Elliot Lampitt. It goes out saying, please do always sign up to the politics at the Telegraph, telegraph.co.uk/chopper for 30 days free access to our best content. But for now, cheerio. Over to you, Rhidian.
This is the thought I wrote back at the beginning of lockdown in April. I'd just been recovering from COVID myself, so I was feeling it. And this was the thought that I wrote. It's called Soap, Lemons, Paracetamol. Wake up, breathe, thank your God for breath. Clean your teeth. Is that a cough? Gargle with salt. Take your tea extra hot. Keep fear at bay and write a list. Take back control with soap, lemons, paracetamol. Check the news, but keep it short. Radio for facts, the birds for true report. What next? Oh yes, exercise. Stand up straight, fill your sacks, your stocks are low. Get on your knees and pray, facing Sainsbury's. Butter, apples, chocolate, cheese. Nearly noon and so little done. Feel inessential, feeling numb. How stuck indoors are deeds of love. Ambition grounded, hopes on hold. Do your taxes, paint the shed. Don't think about what all this means. Keep death at bay with games and memes. Ignore the pressure to achieve. Stare out the window. See that leaf. Watch it blow across the yard. Syrup, wine, sugar, lard. Great events are best left unexplained when in the fire. It needs distance to see the truth cooling with time. 2 meters? Make it 2 years. Leave snap judgments to the tweets of sages and Job's friends. Be still. Know we're not God. From dust we're made, from dust we're raised. Bread, flour, marmalade. Late afternoon, the toll comes in. Want to hear the score again? Worse than China, worse than Spain. Please stop playing this awful game. Some say it's war, but that's unfair to us and them when what we fight has no face, no shame. It's just data doing its thing. Dad, what did you do during the plague? I stayed indoors, got little done, and watched the wind blow through leaves and lives. Milk, pepper, salad, limes. Fail to focus, want to cry, feel low, feel late. Please stop saying this is great when weeks ago the talk was mean. Now in the night the sirens scream and the virus sneaks into our dreams. It's hot. Is that a fever? Open the latch, lift the lever. Offer thanks and praise to the ones who've no time to reminisce or self-improve or say goodbye. A crash course in metaphysics for them. Dusted in days, they're done too soon. Their last question sighs, why? Wheat, barley, corn, rye. So order your affairs and complete that list. Wash your hands and call your mum, that neighbour, friend, your son. Tell them what you always knew. This life's a gift, that love is real, its touch is true. It is the thing that gets us through. This moment, it will pass. So take deep breaths and fill your soul. The spirit's willing, you make that call. Soap, lemons, paracetamol. Paracetamol.